All righty, everyone. It is week 6. I can't believe how quickly it has come. I'm so excited to be with you all again. Thank you all for people that have just kind of stuck with us and going through this journey of reading Julie Dirksen's Design for How People Learn. I am sure that all of you guys can see that we have a lot of special guests with us, but we have also an extra special guest with us, Julie Dirksen, author of Design for How People Learn. All right. So we're so excited. In the chat, please go ahead and let us know where you're from and where you're viewing from. And we're going to go ahead and get right started. All right. So we're going to go ahead and start with our introductions. And I'm going to go with what I see on my screen. So, first person I see is Aaron.
Oh. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. It's been such a wonderful journey to read this book with this group. I'm kind of a vet. I've been in the learning space for about 25 years and in specifically learning design for online spaces for about 10 years now. So it's really great. But I always feel like a new person in that there's always so much to learn. So I know a lot, but I also am always keen to learn. I'm currently working on a big training project, which is redesigning a training for a crown corporation in Canada here. So I've learned a lot from this book that's been really helpful. So I'm looking forward to this chat today. Of course, also having Julie with us. It's nice to be here.
Thank you so much. All right. Next is Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah from North Carolina. I'm currently a doctoral student in applied linguistics, but my background is in languages. Specifically, I'm an ESL teacher, and I also really love learning languages. So, my specialties are Japanese and Spanish. And I'm relatively new to instructional design. I heard about it a couple years ago, but like it's only this year that I've really been getting into learning more about the field and transitioning into the field.
Awesome. Thank you. And Kaya.
Hi, everyone. I'm in Los Angeles, California. Currently, I work as a private learning design consultant. So that whether that's for nonprofits, small startups, different organizations, I help them improve their learning ecosystem with a specialty on technology and evaluation. I got my master's from USC and learning design and technology, and I'm really excited to talk about this book with everyone today.
Thank you so much, Kaya. Sylvia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sylvia McCoy. I am a veteran elementary educator who is transitioning into the instructional design arena. Actually, after reading this book and gaining so much insight from it, I think I'm going to stop telling people I'm an instructional designer just because of the layman's understanding that's associated with, oh, you build trainings, because learning and development and being an L&D practitioner allows me to bring so many more transferable skills from my time in the elementary education arena to actually solve those business needs and close those gaps. That's more than just training. So I'm appreciative of the insights that I've gained from Design for How People Learn, and I'm excited to be with you all today.
Thank you so much for that. And Zoe. Hi, Zoe. I think you're maybe muted.
Yeah, whoops. Hi, everybody. My name is Zoe N. Sugg. I've been an instructional designer for about 5 years now, so it's good to hear from Erin that that feeling of always learning never really goes away. Um, I primarily try to focus on a lot of like scenario-based training, whether I'm developing e-learning or ILT. Um, and I'm an ADHDer, so that it's really fascinating. The more I learn about L&D, the more I understand sort of why my brain has like taken to this industry so well. So it's very fun.
Thank you for that, Zoe. Christine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christine. I'm a college writing tutor who is transitioning into the ID space. As far as the sectors that I want to go to, it's higher ed and ed tech too. Ed technology. I am so sorry. It's because I come from a K through 12 background. Education is something that I'm passionate about, and I've been enjoying this book, and I look forward to contributing to the discussion today. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Christine. I love the wide range that we have here. All right. And Lauren.
Hey there, I'm Lauren Alva, and I am a learning experience designer. New to that, the last year, I've just taken off to kind of upskill and learn all I can about learning sciences and learning theory. And I'm really also into figuring out how to use extended realities, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality to enhance learning, to find different ways to engage learners. So I'm spending a lot of time figuring that out while also figuring out LXD. There's some really great groups out there that I'm trying to join on LinkedIn, and I find myself doing that a lot these days, just like trying to connect with people, hear what people have to say. My background is also in, just like Sarah, is in teaching English language learners, but there's so many things that I can do, I realize now. So I'm trying to channel all of that power in this new direction. And I'm glad to be here with everyone the last week.
Thank you so much, Lauren. All right. And Linda.
Hey, everybody. I'm Linda. I'm in Northern Virginia. As you can probably tell, I'm not from Northern Virginia, but from South Carolina. Graduated from University of North Carolina with a degree in linguistics many, many years ago. Spent many years home educating my kids. And now in phase 2 of my adult life, I've gone back to school for my master's in learning design and technology. And I'm doing some consulting right now, some contract work with a company that designs professional development and DEI training. I'm customizing their DEI courses for clients, and also have a position as a graduate research assistant at George Mason, where I'm getting my master's, working to create a new minor in ethics and artificial intelligence, and trying to figure out if I want to go into higher ed or corporate, because I just don't know. They're both fantastic, and it's hard to pick.
I agree for sure. Thank you so much. And Julie, we're going to do an official introduction of you, but if you want to say a little bit of yourself before that time, please go ahead, Julie.
Oh, sure. Well, lots of things that people have already brought up have resonated. I think my very first paid teaching job was actually English as a foreign language, 1992. So yeah, I think I'm kind of now sort of right up to that 3 decade mark in learning and development and e-learning and training and all of that kind of stuff. And I always say uh, I wound up an instructional designer because I'm happy as long as I get to learn something new, and it doesn't seem to matter that much what it is. Um, so it's a lovely field to work into because pretty much everybody who's attracted to learning design is an interesting, curious, smart person. And so that makes everybody here and everybody in the field really delightful to work with. So thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And my name is Nicole A. Harris, and I am the Learning Solutions Enthusiast. Today, this was not planned. Today marks my first year as an instructional designer. So what a wonderful way to celebrate other than with you guys here today. All right. So I also want to thank everyone, again, like I said, from all over the United States who have been with us. But I'm also really thrilled that we have people today, including panelists from Canada, Kenya, I saw Romania, Indonesia, Australia, and so on and so forth. So thank you guys so much for joining us. And with that, we're going to get right into it. Our chat moderators are going to go and really be present with you all on LinkedIn Live, and we have some cool things planned for you all. So as you guys know, Julie is here, all right? And we're going to go ahead and actually discuss chapter 12. All right, so for all of our panelists, you can answer, as you all know, one of the questions, all of the questions, or any other insights that you guys have. And those who are watching, you all are a part of this book club as well. So as usual, please go ahead and chime on in. And Julie, anytime you want to come in as well. All right, so in your practice, where have there been barriers to good evaluation? And the reason why I started with barriers instead of just good examples, because I think one of the things even Julie mentioned in her book is that it can be a struggle to get to the deep level of evaluation we need to. So I wanted to kind of start there. Also, where have you succeeded in conducting a good evaluation? I would love to hear about that as well. And then overall, what did chapter 12 show you about your own evaluation practice that either reinforced what you already do well or challenged you to improve? So I just want to remind my co-hosts, when you're not talking, make sure to mute just so we can have the best sound. Also, as far as the captions are concerned, we did put a tool in the chat just in case that caption issue wasn't fixed. Accessibility is very important to us. And you guys can go ahead and chime in on any of those questions. And wait time doesn't bother us. We all need time to think.
I'm just going to go ahead and jump on in because I really appreciate this chapter and having the ability to have a conversation about that. And number one is something that I'm going to tackle. I've got something for number two, but I'll come back to that later. So, where are there barriers to good evaluation? I've spent the better half of, or the last 7 or so years helping people implement learning management systems. So less in the instructional design, but more in the implementation. Part of that is also guiding them on how to build a good course as much as possible within the scope of my role. And in the asynchronous, self-enrolled, ongoing enrollment space, evaluation is a challenge because quite often in that you don't have everyone together in a synchronous event. So you can't, peer evaluation is challenging. And a lot of the organizations that I was working with as clients, they didn't want to put a facilitator or moderator, anybody on there. They just wanted to put the course up and let it roll. And so I found that evaluation came down to the multiple choice questions. And I'm wondering if anybody out there has anything more to offer, because that was such a huge barrier. Both, it was technology, but it's just resource wise. So my big barrier is the asynchronous self-enrollment kind of course. So I'm just sort of agreeing with this. I'm wondering if anybody has any other ideas for overcoming those barriers.
Yeah, that's a good one, because I think the resources is always the barrier that I encounter almost anywhere. Because in an ideal world, you have a company that is willing to, devote those resources or facilitators or what have you. And most of the time, that's going to be a challenge to get that allocated. The asynchronicity is an interesting challenge because a lot of the time what we would, then rely on was like role playing and peer evaluation and things like that. And you can kind of do some of the peer evaluation if you have like a message board system. It's better than nothing, but that's not a perfect one-to-one answer for a peer evaluation.
Yeah, that question about asynchronous learning, I think is really important because it speaks to where we are even in our day right now. Because of course we've always had OLTs, online, learning. We've always had that sort of self-paced sort of thing. But one of the things I really appreciated about chapter 12 was how much self-reflection can actually kind of speak to that. At my job currently, it's not my project, but we're doing a lot with inclusion, diversity, and equity. And we have like a whole project called the Inclusive Hiring Badge. And one of the things that they did was we had a lot of live webinars. And after those webinars are finished, what happens often? Sometimes people go back to them, but a lot of times it was just a great event and I have some good notes and it doesn't get revisited again. So my colleague decided to actually put them in an OLT. Now that sounds like, wait, so you just put something in there for people to watch. But what I really appreciated was that they had a set of questions. And those set of questions actually goes to all of us, and our education training specialist who's in the chat today, hey, Candace, who was a chat moderator last week, actually reads through those to make sure that people are actually being thoughtful about what they've watched in that webinar. And a lot of times, if they've just kind of, tried to pass it off with a little answer, she'll be the one to say, hey, can we, we need a little bit more for question 4. And that's kind of what Julie talks about, like that manpower. If you don't always have that manpower, it's hard to do that sort of evaluation, right? Because someone has to read it and someone has to grade it. But I think sometimes we are quick to just think about the barriers. And yes, that may be impossible for, like, the example Julie talked about in her book, 12,000 nurses or whatever, that may be hard. But what are the ways where that can happen? This is not a training, the one that I'm referring to, that we have hundreds and hundreds of people taking it. So reading those evaluations are actually easy. So sometimes I think it's about, all right, yes, there's barriers, but where are those places where I can institute this level of evaluation?
Absolutely. And I'll just jump right in there about talking about the barriers to good evaluation. Like Julie said in the book, usually the evaluation is level 1 reactionary, right? Did you like the course? Was the food good? You're not really understanding their level of understanding and conceptualization of what was taught, right? So getting into whether you're doing multiple choice, true, false, short answer, being very creative in how you deliver that. And also making sure that you're thinking about formative assessment. So very short, punchy questions throughout the assessment. Like, are they following? Can the instructor adjust real time to what they're understanding, right? How much scaffolding or prerequisite information did you provide to them? Did you give handouts? Did they have some homework to do before they entered that? And I think another big barrier is having both subjective and objective data. And what do I mean by that? Is you can send out a survey, you get their responses. There can be bias in how they respond. But what other data? Are you looking at department data? Are they performing? What has changed in their performance in conducting calls or whatever that issue you trained for? Do you actually have data to support that you've seen change, right? We just like, oh, they said they understand. We're good now. This day, we've solved that issue with just this one training for something that can be a systematic issue. So being proactive and working with other departments, looking at other creative ways. I know Julie talked about the portfolio. So if there's a project, like, oh, let's make it project-based and let's make it longitudinal. Let's follow a cohort of learners, whether you're in a corporate environment or a formal environment or in higher education. Follow those students or that cohort, right? Give them creative rubrics into how they should put a portfolio together. What skills are they demonstrating if they're doing a presentation, right? And seeing how they do over time is also very important into evaluating effective measures and then making sure that you're still looking at that as a curriculum.
And just to piggyback on what Kaya is saying there, this is one of those big things I try to do when I'm just in the analysis meeting. So way early on when I'm hearing that someone wants training, my first question is usually like, okay, so what data do you have currently? At one of the companies that I've worked at recently, there was a startup mentality, which is great because people are thinking about how they do best practices, but that means a lot of stuff wasn't established yet. So there was, we need training. What data do you have? Well, we're beginning to collect data. And sometimes it's a hard conversation because I'd have to say like, okay, I need a month worth of data from you before we deploy the training because we need to know sort of our before and after. And some of that is so you know if the training is working. Later on, as you are trying to have other conversations with people about like later trainings or evaluations, that also then folds into your ROI. So it can be kind of like a systemic thing that has to be an ongoing conversation that you start, a couple of months before you even need to begin developing sometimes.
I think another barrier, an issue that I've had with evaluations in general is the timing of the evaluations. We want to wait until the end of the training or the end of the initiative and then ask people to think back, hey, how'd you feel about this? How beneficial was this for you? Whereas I know from my own learning and my own process, as I'm going through, if I jot down right then, I loved how everything went up through the first maybe 30 minutes of this session. And then when we went into the breakout rooms, things kind of got muddled because people were unclear as to what the expectation for the breakout room conversation was. But when I get to the end of a 3 or 5 hour or multiple day session, I'm no longer remembering, okay, this was a real point that I feel like could be improved upon. So I think that because what stood out to me from chapter 12 was the emphasis on practice and feedback. So I feel like the feedback needs to be interwoven throughout the session, throughout the learning experience, so that we can really get those key points and details and be able to make impactful and meaningful changes later on.
Also, just getting your company to let you sit in on the course too is invaluable.
I wanted to tag on to that, and Kaya said it, and then Sylvia just sort of went through that. Something that I used to try and encourage my clients to use in the learning management system that I was using at the company that I worked at had a poll option within the course. And so for these, self-enrolled, self-guided, self-directed courses, I was like, put some polls in there so they could do exactly that. Like, do a little chapter, how are you doing? And it could be just taking a pulse on how they're doing in the course, or a knowledge check, and all those kinds. Nobody would adopt it. I was like, it's a really good idea though, because you get these micro doses of data that you could then use, as we're saying, is to either like improve the learning experience or assess whether or not I've got the right materials to move the learner forward. And so I'm glad to hear that other instructional designers think that's a good idea. I just have to learn how to encourage my clients to go with it a little bit more.
I love what you guys have brought up, because not only is it just kind of barriers with stakeholders, it's sometimes kind of just our own limiting belief of what can be accomplished in that space. And I really think that this discussion really opens up the fact that no, it can be done and it is done. And especially when we think about, all of us are here because we want to improve our practice, right? So when you think about that level one, did you like it? Was it a good experience? Why go through all of that effort to make a great learning experience and then to not actually have real feedback? Like, that's the thing that we want, to make sure that the end result is what we want. Actually assessing, are the learners able to do what they came to do? When I read this book, I was reading all these great ideas, and I was just like, oh, if only we did that at my workplace, and we could do that at my workplace. And I think that was just my initial reaction. And then I was like, I'm getting my talking points here. Then I was like, actually, I have seen some examples of that at my job. So again, I'm only a year in, so not all of these projects are mine. But one of the things we did is we realized, so I work in higher ed, but I don't work student and faculty side. I actually work in HR. So we're training faculty and staff. So it feels corporate within an HR, within a higher ed space. And one of the things we realized was that a bunch of our HR professionals weren't actually getting a cohesive training. Where I work, there's 31,000 employees statewide. So in that regard, people were doing their own thing in the different centers all over the state. So we recently launched a comprehensive HR onboarding program. And one of the things I saw that we did well was the pilot phase. And it's raining and thundering here. If you hear it, I'm in Florida. So if you hear anything in the background. But one of the things we did was we created the training. We worked extensively with the SMEs, of course. But then we actually had HR professionals come to each of those trainings and give us their feedback. And it was just so helpful, because it radically changed a lot of the training we did before we actually gave it to the learners. And it seems like so common sense, but so often, because of deadlines or, our stakeholders and what they want, we just skip past that. And I feel that a lot of our new HR onboarding people are going to actually be able to do what they're supposed to do in a more cohesive way. Even though our SMEs put a lot of work into it, and I put a lot of work and my colleagues did, it would have just been null and void if we'd not done the pilot process. So that was a recent experience where I was like, the pilot process is crucial. I don't think you can skip it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you're in something that, a consulting group that I'm doing some work with right now, I think their motto is like, nothing for you without you. And so they do a lot of work with, accessibility and neurodivergent people. And so they can't create courses without having a pilot test of that audience group, or even create it. And I think it's super important. And I agree. I see so many people try to, do a big, huge splash out launch of their course, and they haven't tested it yet. And I'm like, uh-oh, what could go wrong? So yeah, always test. And if you can get it, for the people in that group, I think that's the most important piece.
Absolutely. So today is a little bit different, as you all know, because one, we only have one chapter. And of course, we really want to get into our questions with Julie. So I'm going to just throw this out to our audience members or any of our panelists to just look at the other questions. I'm interested in knowing maybe where you've succeeded in conducting a good evaluation, or just in chapter 12 overall. What were some things in chapter 12 that really showed you, you know what, I actually do have a great evaluation practice? Or here are some things that I'm challenged to improve.
One of the suggestions that I really loved about from this chapter was the observations, and then doing a brief survey, and then kind of whittling it down into a smaller focus group, where if you go back, because our focus is on changing the behavior, not just throwing a bunch of knowledge at people. So after we've conducted this learning experience, now we need to go back into the actual business environment and look at how the behavior is changing and shifting. And that can help us figure out whether or not the learning experience we designed was effective in targeting what we wanted targeted for the business purpose. Also, then being able to send out a very brief, and the emphasis was on brief survey. I remember making that note. It doesn't need to be 15 million questions, because people are not going to fill that out and nobody has time. But to figure out who is now implementing the new strategies, who has evolved and shifted their behavior, and then who is not, and then being able to interview just that core group to find out what was effective in helping you to change your behavior. What was ineffective? Why did your behavior not change? Did you feel like this, you were not the target audience? Did you feel like it was the wrong level of expertise? I just really felt like those 3 key points just opened up an idea of what evaluation really meant, and that it's not just all about Kirkpatrick's level 1.
There is just 2 things. I'll keep this super quick. 2 things I want to piggyback on. The one is when we're talking about focus groups, I just really, really wanted just to highlight this phrase from Julie on page 275. You have a phrase in here that says, tell your learners that they can't do anything wrong. And that's huge. When I've shadowed people being like, I am not evaluating you. I need to see if this training works. There is no way you can mess this up. Do not be nervous. And just that is such a useful conversation to have when you're shadowing your learners. So that has taken me far. The other thing is if you have whatever learning management system you are working in, sometimes you're lucky enough to have a team administrating it. Sometimes it's just you and good luck. But do your research. Go visit the About page, go ask your learning architect team what you can track, because there's things that I have done that are not the multiple choice quiz that I've been able to pull. Articulate has a thing called free form questions or something like that. And you can track those if you have an advanced enough LMS. So see what you can do, which tracks, like if you have a branching scenario, do your learners go, down the wrong path, and try to figure out why. Just those have both helped me a lot as I've worked through things.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important. We're talking about it when it's learner facing, but I also like the fact that Julie talked about how are we continuously evaluating our own practice. And one of the things I know that happens in our department, if we're doing an ILT, which is instructor-led face-to-face, whether that be virtual through Zoom or actually in person, we go through a ton of run-throughs. I mean, we read it and go through it through our team like about 3 times, and it gets picked apart, and we do it and we come back together. And coming from the K-12 space, you kind of just put it all together with the time you have and you just deliver it, And in the space I'm in now, we don't deliver any training without at least having so many touch points with it. And that has been crucial to our own practice. And we scrutinize, not critique. We critique everything. Like, is this alignment correct? Is the cognitive load too much? Is there extraneous information on this slide deck? Do you really need to tell them this information? And I mean, it can be grueling, but it has been so helpful. And then even the evaluations, like we definitely have some level 1 evaluations we do, but we always have open-ended questions. Can you demonstrate how you will use this? And one of the classes I teach called Making Meetings Work, I thought that I got my breakout rooms down to a science. And in my last evaluation, though my overall score was great, I still got feedback for the second time that they felt like the breakout rooms were too long and there was too much to read before they could even get to the answer. So guess what? I am back to the drawing board for like the third or fourth time. And I thought that I cut it. But if I just said, oh, whatever, I really like it, and I spent a lot of time and that story is really creative, then I'm not helping the learner. So it's really important that we're open to that same feedback as well. All right. Does anybody have any last part to say about chapter 12? I know like every week we could go on forever. I think we barely scratched the surface of evaluation. But does anyone have any last thoughts before we kind of switch gears and kind of do our one-on-one with Julie?
Can I just
I'll just add.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, the thing I'll add to any instructional designer and admin is, again, to be thinking about designing with the end in mind. What are your outcomes for your activity or your course? Look at it both broadly for the curriculum, then by lesson, right? And then what assessment method would be most appropriate, right? Multiple choices isn't always appropriate if you're evaluating performance. Then you might want to look into performance rubrics or portfolios for projects. So I think always thinking about the appropriate assessment item. I think reiterating what everyone said about it being mastery orientation, right? Not we're going to fail you if you don't get these questions right. This is for you to help master what you've learned, to help with those retrieval practices, to help store that into your long-term memory, right? So that you're creating assessments to help them be able to do what they need to do, whether it's on the performance or acquiring new knowledge about a different domain.
Thank you for that. I think that's really important. When is it mastery and when is it, hey, we're trying to get you to that goal? Kai, I think that's gold. Thank you so much. Aaron.
Yeah, I was going to just tell a quick story. I'll try and make it quick because it's kind of a meta evaluation story. And this is back in my classroom days. So I taught Canadian studies at the university level to international students who are coming into Canada to do graduate studies. And I took them to the art gallery and I thought it was going to be great. And it was a disaster because I didn't know what to do. And I went back and I evaluated myself and what I could do better. And I totally redesigned the lesson. And we started with developing our own criteria for what is art and what is good art, what makes art art. And so we developed our own rubric, and that was interesting. And then we went and looked at street art because there's a lot of graffiti in downtown Vancouver. So we went and looked at some graffiti. I was like, is this art? And they're like, oh, I don't know. And then we went to the art gallery, and I'd spent 4 hours in there before the lesson, like making very clear, like go here, go there, do this. And then they did a presentation. And after that, they were like, I didn't even know I could do any of these things. I've never looked at art before. I've never been to an art gallery before. And it was one of the most successful lessons that I ever had. And so there was multiple layers of evaluation, starting with evaluating myself and then the learners coming up with their own criteria, which I think is something that I took forward moving on, and especially with I've never worked actually with children, so it's more with adult learners, but come up with your own criteria for what you think is good X, and then we did the presentations and I said, okay, come up with your own criteria for what makes a good presentation. We did it together and we agreed on what that was. And then they used that to evaluate themselves, peer evaluation, and it was really great. And so evaluation is good about evolution of design as well.
I love that, the evolution of design. And Aaron, it goes back to what we've been talking about, which is trusting the learner, right? That they are making them feel smart, like Julia's talked about, trusting the learner. So how can evaluation even be more participatory, right? So awesome. All right, guys. So we are switching gears now. And let me go ahead. And as you guys know, Julie is here. So we're going to actually switch gears, and this is going to be a time for all of us to kind of get to know more about Julie's practice, how she even wrote this book, and all of us panelists, and you all included, will get a chance to actually ask Julie questions. All right. So again, we want to thank Julie for being here with us. I am just going to read a little bit about Julie, and I'm looking down at my notes. So one of the things that is so cool about Julie is that Julie has had clients from anywhere from K-12, but also Fortune 500 companies, technology startups. Julie has not just a background in instructional design, but a background and a passion for UX design. And Sarah, one of our chat moderators, also passionate about UX design, so I know that will be exciting for you. Game-based learning and behavior change, which is also the topic of Julie's next book. And you guys might have seen in the chat that Julie has a class that she's currently offering. And if you're in Florida, Julie will also be in the flesh in Florida at the Learning Solutions Conference. And she's been an adjunct member in the visualization department at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, where she's taught courses in project management, instructional design, and cognitive psychology, and even an interest in how glucose affects the brain. Julie is just a wealth of information. So I am excited. And I'm going to start with the first question. And I just want you to tell us, Julie, why this book? What made you write this book? What approaches and methodology provided the framework for how you organize it? So overall, I guess my question, Julie, is what was the goal of writing this book?
Yeah, and before I jump into that, let me just say that that was a really fantastic conversation about chapter 12. I really enjoyed that. So I kept thinking, oh, we should mention this, and then somebody would say it, and I'm like, oh, there you go. So
Awesome.
but yeah, no, that was great. The book came about. Sometimes people ask me how long the book took, and it's either a year or 10 years, depending on when you start counting. But somewhere I have a page of notes that I wrote down in, I want to say 2001 at a conference in San Francisco that summer. I started making notes about topics and things like that. And since the book came out in 2011, that's the 10-year mark. Once I actually had a book contract in 2010, it was about a year of writing, or a little less, actually, probably 6, 7 months. But the book kind of came about partially because it really felt like we were sort of missing a first book in the field a little bit. When I was in graduate school, the closest thing to a genuinely accessible text that like anybody could pick up and read was probably the Mager Six Pack, which was Robert Mager's stuff, which is still great books, but they're 50 years old now, something like that, and they're also a little expensive and things like that. But if you saw, oh, if you were interested in user experience, people would give you Don't Make Me Think, which is by Steve Krug. And it's a great book and everybody should read it. Absolutely. Especially if you're going to do user testing of your own, especially digital resources and things, which you absolutely, absolutely should. Or if you were going to interested in getting started with graphic design, they'd give you the Non-Designer's Design book by Robin Williams. And there's a few others that fit into that space too. And it really felt like there wasn't a good book for that in L&D. There were some books that are like, here's how you do a lesson plan, or some things like that, but not necessarily kind of like let you understand the foundations. And what we have in this field, although we've got a really diverse background here, and I think we always have that in the field, but what we still have in the field is a lot of people who come to learning and development through domain knowledge. So it's the, hey, you're a good customer service rep, we're going to let you train the customer service reps. Or you're a good web designer, here, do a class on web design, or whatever. Here, you're a senior flight attendant, we're going to help you, move you over here and have you help design flight attendant training. And that, so all of these people were incredibly sophisticated in their domain, but then when it came time to sort of translate that into how do I teach this to somebody else, they were just kind of like, fake it till you make it. And that seemed unfortunate because we would get a lot of things that looked like good training, like, okay, they have a PowerPoint and they stand in front of the class and they explain stuff. And so, like that's not enough, right? That's not a good learning experience. That's the window dressing of a good learning experience. And so, what are the underlying things that people need to understand in order to do that? And so that was the goal, was to create a Don't Make Me Think equivalent for instructional design that anybody could like pick up and read, and wanted it to be a plane ride book, like not more than about 4 hours to get through. you know, wanted it to be something that you could read no matter, you know, what your background was and all of that kind of stuff. So they're not too academic, but yet still based on good principles, all those things. So
Thank you for that. I have another question because I know that you've been designing e-learning since, as it says in your one of your bios, before the or during the pre-internet days, when
yeah.
we called computer-based training. So, what would you say are the principles that remain for good learning design, even though the landscape has changed? So, even though the technology has changed and the accessibility has changed, what are some principles that kind of stand the test of time, pre-internet and now?
Oh, well, with e-learning, there's we kind of consistently have an issue. So when I first started getting involved with e-learning, it was distributed on things like CD-ROMs, and it was we were building it in mostly authorware, subdirector, things like that. And they were doing some really kind of interesting things in terms of creating interactive stuff, creating things that had some, you know, real sophistication. Because the feedback problem is a really interesting one. When we were talking about feedback is the hardest thing to scale in everything that we do, right? Content scales easily. I can send this video to 100 people or 100,000 people, and then I just need to make sure I've got a little bit more bandwidth allocated. But it's not a hard problem these days necessarily. But if I need to give feedback to 100 people versus feedback to 1,000 people, that's a really different. It's a really different problem. It's a really different thing. And part of the reason we see such a difference between what e-learning looks like in corporate workplace environments versus higher ed environments goes to that feedback question. You know, I think the higher ed environments understand that like you have to grade students, they have to be able, you know, we have to be able to give them feedback on things, and that needs to be staffed, and there needs to be humans who do that. And that there are limitations to using a multiple choice test for everything and all that kind of thing. But within the like actual environments where you could do interesting things and have something that wasn't just information delivery in the format, they were doing some kind of cool stuff in those early CD-ROM days. And then we got to the point where we wanted to put it all on the web, and it kind of all got stupid because we had web pages and we had a little bit of JavaScript, and we had the first web-based training thing that I ever did was rollovers on a screen layout. Like it was, you know, what are the different fields on a computer screen? And it was in Feature Splash 2, which was the pre-runner to Flash before Macromedia bought it. So this is how much I'm dating myself. But we couldn't do interactive stuff. We couldn't do anything terribly interesting. But then, you know, as the technology advanced, oh, all of a sudden we could do some really cool stuff in Flash, and we were doing some really interesting kinds of things. And then we decided it all needed to be, you know, rapid authoring systems, and so it all kind of got stupid again. And then we were kind of getting some interesting stuff in that space. And then they decided it needs to be mobile and responsive, and it kind of all got stupid again. And now we're getting to the point where we're getting a few interesting things in the mobile responsive space, but we kind of keep resetting the clock on what the possibilities are for things that we can do. And I will tell you, you know, when I was working on stuff in the early 2000s, there was never an expectation that you would do this stuff without a developer. And there's been an kind of an arms race in the number of responsibilities that they put into these instructional design roles. Jane Bozart's written about this a little bit, and the fact that like, you know, when I was in the early 2000s, I was working for a company called Allen Interactions, which is Michael Allen's company, and he was the original architect behind Authorware, which was the sort of one of the really original design for purpose learning authoring tools, and you could do really cool things in Authorware. It just didn't make the jump to the web very well. But anyway, all of this history is to say that um, I think this goes back to the earlier conversation we were having about feedback. We've always struggled to establish our value, especially in workplace environments. And so, what has been the focus of a lot of what's been happening is how do we do the same thing but do it faster and cheaper? And so that's forced us into authoring tools. It's forced us into instructional designers who suddenly need to be also multimedia experts and developers and all of these kinds of roles, instead of how do we do better things with the resources that we have. And the part of the problem with that is it's seen as a cost center to reduce in organizations rather than an investment where if we put more resources into it, we're going to get additional payback. But the difficulty is kind of telling that story and demonstrating that benefit. And so it's something where, unfortunately, it just turns into this: how do we make this happen as cheaply as possible? Not how do we do it really, really well.
Thank
Yeah,
you
thank
for
you for that. Yeah, thank you for that context, Julie, because I'm interviewing right now. And so I just came out of a conversation about like, well, here's all my learning theory. Okay, but can you do tech? Well, yeah, I can do tech, but if we really want to get back to the conversation about, analysis, then
Yeah.
yeah.
And I very much believe that trying to conflate all of those roles into a single person is a terrible, terrible idea. So, I
Yes.
think the people who are really great at some of the analysis or design pieces shouldn't necessarily also be the people who are like rendering the video and, dealing with splicing up the audio recordings and whatever else. So,
Yeah. Well, in the last like several teams I was on, we had basically like SMEs that got made into, trainers. And then we had people like me who like, I know Adobe stuff and I know learning theory, but I don't know anything about your industry. And so they ended up sort of mashing together that skill set from the people that were on the team. But that's not a thing that most companies are willing to talk about, So interesting.
Yeah, I really think that's such an important thing that you've mentioned, especially because there's all this talk, which rightfully so, about upskilling, right? And people who want to be in the industry should be upskilling. But a lot of times it's like, what is actually being upskilled? And is it things that are really going to affect the learner? So that's really important. Is any other panelists have any questions for Julie?
Yes, I was going to add on to that, and then I also have a
Yes.
question for you, Julie. So adding on to that too, it's like when people, I know that since the pandemic, there has been a boom in availability for instructional designs. There's been more investment than ever because usually, I've been working in the industry for over 8 years. It was a struggle getting people to understand the value in learning and development. And now other organizations who needed to move on to fully async modalities, online learning, they try to just create one row that's like 5 people in one, right? And that's also a red flag of looking at the organization. That means they're not investing enough to scale up that department. They're trying to have one person take on everything.
Yeah.
And if we have teachers or other people who are not traditionally from a learning background, they're the ones who are vying for those roles. Oh, I have to learn everything. I need to get into this. This is what I need to do. It's not realistic. It's not sustainable. And overall, it just speaks to the organization's investment in learning development. So I would say to those roles, no, right? You want to find a team. There should be an e-learning developer on there. There should be subject matter experts who are not developing, right? All their job, you're as an instructional designer, your job is to extract that information from them, right? We know experts kind of miss it out. You help them pull out pieces of information they didn't think was useful to a novice learner, right? So being very tactful and looking at how are different organizations functioning and how the value that you bring shouldn't be dismissed because you can't do 50,000 things in once, right? Like I am specializing in instructional design. I can design curriculum. I'm thinking about evaluation and assessment, and we have other people who can build it. So I would add that to anyone who's thinking about transitioning into this field. Ask a bunch of different questions. Ask us, and get different perspectives on what's happening in learning development, and don't feel cheated in a role where you're underpaid and you're overworked. And then, Julie, my follow-up question to you is, since you wrote your book, how has that changed your career in the learning development space, and what did that look like for your business?
Yeah, it was it's a pretty it's been a pretty radical shift for me in terms of how things are going. I worked for Alan for about 8 years, like 2000 to 2008. Then I ran briefly for about a year and a half the online training group for a company that did project management training and stuff like that. And at a certain point, I was kind of looking, that was, I guess that's mid-career, something like that. But at a certain point, I was looking, okay, when we look at advancement, and this is a challenge in lots of fields, but I was like, okay, I can try to advance through kind of the management structure in an organization. So that kind of, aiming towards like a chief learning officer position or something like that. Now I had my sort of relatively brief flurry of managing a team. I was like, I really miss getting my hands on the stuff, right? I really missed the design piece. I really missed, actually working with those kinds of things because at a certain point, that managerial role is traffic cop and resource management and people, smoothing of, interpersonal stuff and all those kinds of things, which are great roles. And God bless the people who sit in that, but that didn't really seem to fit for me. I knew people who had like started their own company and had like a small team, small thing and growing an organization and that kind of startup thing. And I'm like, yeah, okay. But again, really not doing the thing. And then in terms of stuff, it really was sort of this. I'd never loved the term, but kind of this thought leader path or kind of a guru sort of thing. And I've always said I don't want to be the captain of the starship, but I like science officer. I think that's a great role. I like nerding out and understanding how things work and then figuring out how do you talk to people about them and things like that. And so that's where kind of being an independent has really sit. So like my business model right now is kind of do a certain amount of consulting. I do a certain amount of workshops and training materials. I do a certain amount of speaking engagements and things like that. And that's basically, how I get paid for stuff. But the that suited me well in terms of that and in terms of personality. But I think the career development piece is always about figuring out what are your superpowers and kind of moving towards that. Um, and trying to force yourself. I did project management for about 10 years. And then when I finally stopped doing project management, I'm like, oh, I kind of hated doing project management. It's much nicer now. So, um, so trying to like figure out, Tim Ferriss has a thing that he says, what are things that you find easy that other people seem to find hard? And that's a good pointer towards things that you probably should be spending your time doing. And I think it's even more easy. I think it more than easy. What are things that you find easy, but also rewarding or interesting, and that other people, find difficult or find overwhelming or whatever? Like that's kind of a little clue that that's a superpower you should probably move forward towards. And then figuring out how do you get into a role where you're doing more of that. And I mean, we all pay dues. Like that's fine. I can say that you should always have a graphic designer and a media person attached to a project, but I have cropped thousands of pictures in Photoshop to glue into e-learning things, and I've edited audio badly, and I've done a bunch of that stuff, and you know, um, nobody thinks it's a good idea for me to do the graphic design. Everybody's pretty clear on that one, but like we're all going to do some things that don't necessarily fit with us, but you should hopefully, like with each role or each successive thing, be moving a little bit closer towards those things.
Thank you so much for that. That's so valuable. We have a question from an audience member, Jordan Hopkins. Would love to hear your plans for your next book you're developing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next book is going to be designed for behavior change, more or less. I mean, I don't know that that's going to be the title, but that's the topic of it. And I've been doing workshops on this for about 5-6 years now, I think. I got interested in this topic in kind of the mid 2000s. I wound up on a project through the university. It was partially through the University of Minnesota and some other organizations, and it was an AIDS and HIV prevention project where they were trying to do online interventions with this particular target audience, which is internet users. It was based in the US, and so this was by 2005 or whenever it was. This was an audience that had gotten the message. It wasn't a case of nobody had happened to mention to them that condom usage was a good idea. And so I was sitting here going, all right, the tools that I have in my toolkit for disseminating knowledge or helping people understand things are not the problem here. They've gotten the message and they understand it, and something else is going on. And I was really feeling like there should be more tools in this toolbox. Like this isn't enough. And so I got interested in, some of the psychology literature and some of the things like that. And I think it was about 2010 when Nudge came out, which is a book by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, I'm pretty sure. And it was behavioral economics, and it was like, oh, there's some interesting stuff in here about behavior, which then led to an interest in behavioral science and things like that. I'm a big fan of the stuff that's coming out of University College London Center for Behavior Change. Susan Mickey is a really great person in that space, and she's got a model called COMB that I think is a really nice kind of comprehensive model. And I always refer to these as people know what to do, but they're still not doing it. Anything that fits into that space where there's something else going on, there's some other issue. It could be fear, anxiety, discomfort. It could be misaligned incentives. It could be a delayed or absent feedback. There are all of these reasons why, even though people know the thing, the behavior still isn't happening in the world, and that these are problems that need different solutions. We've all just lived through a good chunk of the world's largest behavior change experiment. And in some ways, COVID is kind of like been a nightmare from a behavior change point of view, but in other ways, it's been amazing. Like the number of people who changed their behavior very quickly in response to this thing that happened is actually extraordinary. And I would argue probably unprecedented in the history of the world, just in terms of how much behavior change happened, how quickly. Now, we saw the mess that was like early pandemic fuzziness about guidelines, and some things like that. But there have been a lot of really, really smart people who are working very hard on the question of how do we help people take the best, safest actions when they can, and how do we communicate that? How do we help people understand it? And so it's generated a lot of really great research in the academic space, and I just think is such an interesting set of problems. Like, I don't ever need to work on software training ever again. I like hard, chewy problems. Like this one's a really tough audience that we're really struggling to deal with, and I'm like, yay, that sounds like fun. So
Can you tell us again the name of the school that's working on behavior change and some of the work that you said that you're really
yeah,
interested in?
it's University College London, so UCL, and they have their Center for Behavior Change. And the principal investigator is Susan Mickey, so Michie. And her model is COMB, COM-B, which is capability, opportunity, motivation equals behavior. And while that sounds very simple at the top level, it's actually got an enormous amount of depth underneath it. And they've been doing things like building a taxonomy of behavior change interventions out that they've seen in the research literature. And they did surveys across a bunch of different behavior change models that had popped up and tried to kind of distill it into a single comprehensive model.
Thank you for that. And I think that that's going to be really powerful in our space, what you're doing. So thank you for giving us the sneak peek. You guys heard it here. Well, I don't know if it's first, but we can say you guys heard it here first. We had a question from one of our chat moderators, Christine. How have you approached, or, what do you usually think if there's people that are maybe really critical of the practices that you've put forth? Is there any way that you've kind of think about that, or how do you tend to deal with that?
Yeah. Well, and I saw one question go by in the chat about somebody who was asking, people's response to things like learning styles and so forth. And there's so for the record, there have been a couple of meta-analyses looking at learning styles, and they've specifically looked at differentiated instruction. So based on you're a visual learner, we're going to create more visual learning materials for you, or you're an auditory learner, we're going to create more auditory materials for you. And the summary in these meta-analyses, which look across a big swath of research studies and is kind of the best we have in terms of evidence on it, says, you know what, this is a waste of everybody's time and it doesn't seem to be making a big difference. Yeah, right. But then people will get all unhappy because anybody's talking about learning styles. And even somebody like Daniel Willingham, who's probably one of the main kind of one of the main people talking about, the problems with this, will admit that like it's probably true that not everybody learns exactly the same. However, any kind of learning style inventory that leads across has a couple of things that are probably tough to swallow. So one is that we actually have adequately identified these learning differences in people, right? And that we can name them, and we've got a taxonomy that encompasses them instead of stuff that people have just kind of made up. 2, that we can assess it in any meaningful way, and 3, that we can then translate that into something that is more effective in terms of a learning experience for that person. And so, 100 years from now, somebody may have cracked all that code, and we will be right back around and going, learning styles are amazing. Please don't quote me on that. Don't sniff that that sniff. But the issue is that it's not an effective place for us to put our resources right now. Now, you mentioned in the bio that I used to teach art students, and I would talk about things like Gardner's multiple intelligences with them, and they loved that because a lot of the kids who wound up in art school were there because the more traditional scholastic mediums were not their thing. And so acknowledging that people have differences, acknowledging that people have various strengths, great, all fantastic. An inventory that purports to measure your learning style and translate it into a thing, not great, right? Um, so that becomes the question. I'm a big believer in not like insisting that anybody's dumb or wrong or whatever to believe in these things, because we all had those moments. And what you want is for people to be curious and to go, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that, and then understand the subtleties of it. Because there's certain things that are out there in the world. Morabian's little communication pie chart, if you've ever seen that one, that insists, I can't remember what the numbers exactly are, but that 97% of the conversation is through body language and not the verbal meaning. And I'm like, really? Come on, logically, we have a problem there. Would you understand 97% of a physics lecture if you turned the sound off? I don't think you would. Could I understand 97% of what's going on in a fight between, um, a married couple if I watched it? Maybe. But, like, context matters here. And also, that research doesn't say that. The research says if the tone of voice contradicts the words, people are more likely to believe the tone. So if I say honey, or I say honey, the question is, honey's a nice word, but the tone in the second version is not happy. And so if you're given a choice between the two, you're more likely to believe the tone. That's what that research measures. But if people aren't kind of going and looking at how stuff is developed or what they actually tested and just kind of taking the surface level explanation of things, then we get into problems. Then we get into learning styles inventories that are not helping anybody. I've seen really poor uses. MBTI is another one that doesn't have a really great evidence base. And I've seen people genuinely distressed because their MBTI doesn't match what they think the managerial profile is, and therefore maybe they shouldn't apply for this job. And I'm like, everything about that statement is unfortunate and wrong. And there is no deterministic version of personality inventories that are out there. The ocean model is probably the closest, but even that, nothing's a given in that space, and so you shouldn't ever take it too easily, or ask questions, understand how it got derived, understand where it came from, where you can. So
I really feel like we can talk to Julie all day. I don't know about you guys, but I definitely feel that way. This is something I'm going to definitely be watching again to replay and just kind of take my own notes. I want to throw it to the other co-host. If you guys have any questions for Julie, please go ahead. And as you guys can see, it's past 1, but Julie's here with us for a few more minutes.
Yep.
So if you guys want to ask Julie any questions.
I mean, I'm just going to bring it back to the conversation about learning styles and how that needs to be probably be amongst instructional designers and administrators, is that there isn't evidence that supports it. So I know a lot of teachers who are like, oh, he's an auditory learner. They do that survey and said, you're not really understanding what your learner needs, right? If we look at the information processing system, right? We say how you take sensory information, you have to gain their attention, right? That goes into their working memory. We talk about retrieval practices so they can store that into their long-term memory. But we really should be looking at mitigating cognitive load, right? Are we putting slides that have distractive images, heavy in text, weird letters bolded, right? They can't process that much information at one time. So being better at scaffolding that. Also assessing their motivation, right? So are they really motivated to learn? Is this training that they're required to do and they just don't care because they're required? Is this something informal where they self-elected, right? We can assume that they're more motivated. So we're thinking about their self-efficacy, right? Their intrinsic motivation and their extrinsic motivation. That's what we would really want to hang our hat on and focus on better. Like, how, as instructional designers, can we best design for learning, right? Because we know the human brain is like a computer. We can't just like, oh, there's one thing. I'm like, if you see an image, you're not going to know all the words or the things from it. Like, we need to focus on just creating better learning activities that are using best multimedia practices and best practices on mitigating cognitive load.
Yeah, the other, if we're piggybacking on the learning styles, a big one I get is people confuse learning styles for accessibility. And so I've had a conversation with a stakeholder where someone went, oh, we don't need captions for the auditory learners because this person is speaking clearly. And I will not, take up more time in this chat talking about all of the things that are wrong with that statement. But, for the people that know, right, there's like 5 or 6 red flags there. And ultimately, it does not help you become more accessible. But people think, oh, well, auditory learning, and so this is why we have this, and this is what, this means to be accessible in this way. And it's not correct, any of that. And so, yeah, we really need to be very you see me nodding enthusiastically over here. Like, I do not tend to go into those conversations with that much ire. I tend to be very like, okay, well, but yeah, learning styles need to be eradicated if we're speaking, privately amongst professionals.
Yeah, well, and about the accessibility piece, I mean, that's absolutely something that I know that I keep learning in that space. I'm trying to be, mindful and useful and do the things, but I know that I have lots of things that I need to improve about my practice, but I'm encouraged by the fact that there's so much better resources around it now than there used to be. Susie Miller's book, she's out of the UK, is good, but there's also, I think, a lot more resources around in the world about improving accessibility, because that should absolutely be table stakes. That should be something that everybody is, their starting point. And so, yeah. And the fact that you have to explain the difference between that and learning styles is like, oh, okay. But, you fight the fight on those things. So.
Absolutely. So I'm going to ask our co-panelists if you have any last questions, and if not, I have one last one. Anyone else?
I really enjoy what you say about asking if we can have learners test out. I think the conversation that I always run into is, how do we devote resources to making sure the test is accurate enough for people to be testing out? And so if you have anything you want to expand on that would be lovely.
Yeah, there's a bunch of challenges there, right? Like, I tend to think if you've got a knowledge gap specifically that you're dealing with your learner audience, then a multiple choice test is probably a decent testing mechanism for it. As soon as you move beyond knowledge gaps, if it's procedural or skills based or any of these other kinds of areas, you have problems trying to run that through a multiple choice test. And I feel like a lot of my career, there was this sort of insistence on having 10 questions at the end of the module. And, one of my least favorite things is when I see trivia questions show up for something that's skills based, right? Like, what are the 4 principles of X? And it's kind of like, that doesn't tell me anything about whether this person can do X. And so that's a challenge, right? Because again, when we talk about the scale issue, it's easy to write a multiple choice test and disseminate it. We have lots of tools for that. If we're trying to actually do performance assessment, that is more challenging, and also really more important to have methods that you're actually assessing it for. So I think letting people test out of content is fantastic if you can do it, but you really do run into this issue of, will this pre-test adequately tell me? Now, if it's a test on, I just need to know the indications for this medication, and I need to know what the side effects are, and I need to know prescribing guidelines, yeah, probably test out on that, right? If it's, I need to counsel a patient on using this in a way that, and I need to talk to them in a way that we're hopefully going to get good medical adherence, then that's probably not a multiple choice test, even if you write really good scenario-based questions for it and things like that. So I think, I'm a big fan of not making people sit through stuff they already know. That makes me crazy, and I'm very sympathetic to that. So trying to find the right level for those things so that you're feeling confident about it. Because most of those pre-post quizzes aren't very good. If you've ever had the thing where you've guessed your way through the pre-test and you don't really know this content, but you can kind of just guess your way. I was at a conference a few years ago, and I'm sorry I don't know this guy's name because I would totally give him credit, but he told me he would do the husband test, and he would basically give his husband any pre-test that he wrote, and if his husband could score above 60% on it, he knew it was a bad pretest. And I'm like, I love that. That is amazing. So there are mechanisms for that, which actually circles around to, you can use good evidence-informed practices for lots of things that you do, but that testing it out in some real world way is like, you can't do one or the other. You got to, both are really important. And if you can only do one, I would pick testing. So, but looking at making sure we're trying stuff out, because I think as a profession, we're also kind of starved for feedback for ourselves. So knowing that the thing that you're doing this week was better than the thing you were doing last month or a year ago, the way that you get better is you get feedback on your efforts and then you improve next time. And so I think that that's something that we absolutely need to look for as professionals, is ways to get feedback on the things that we're doing that can help us make it better too.
All right. Well, Julie, I have appreciated you. I know that you have to run in a second, but I have a question for you. So many people don't know about our industry. I don't know about you all, but you tell someone you're an instructional designer, and unless they've known you for a while, that's a lot of explaining, a lot of, but every adult in a workplace is affected by it. Do you think it matters that our role is so hidden, so to speak? Do you think there should be more efforts to let other people who are not in our industry kind of know our importance just in a casual, everyday way?
So the answer is yes. One of the difficulties with our field, I think, is that if we do our jobs right, we make things not seem easy, right? Like, it's easy to understand this thing, or it's easy to do it. And I think that any domain where the output is clear and easy to understand has a tendency to get devalued. So like a CEO can look at a ream of computer code and know that they themselves could not do that. We know that we can't write legal language if we're not lawyers. We know that we're not capable of prescribing medication if we're not doctors. But when people look at the stuff that we create, they're like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And so then there's this idea that it must not have been that hard to get it to that point. And so I think that goes back a little bit to the, being able to tell the story of what we're doing and why it's useful and how it helps people, and being able to kind of establish that. In terms of whether or not it should be a recognizable job title, I mean, I'm more surprised when somebody does know what it is than, I mean, I go in with the assumption that if I say I'm an instructional designer, I'm going to get the blank look. And then I'm going to have to explain. And every once in a while I don't. And I'm like, oh, okay. We don't have to have the whole conversation about how I help people design training things, and help people design curriculum for stuff, and educational psychology and whatever. My friend Judy just says I make things that help people learn, and I think that's always a nice phrase for stuff. But yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think if people can see the value of it, we know that if we don't have training, bad things happen. So I think there's an understanding there, but I think telling the story of how we're what value we're providing is important. User experience people have a similar issue. If you know what UX is and you understand it, you understand how important it is and how crucial it is for designing good, anything basically. But they also, will frequently tell people they're a user experience person and get the blank look and stuff like that. I don't know. We might get paid more if people knew what we did. I don't know. So, um, but I think being able to tell the story of our value within the organizations that we're working in, and being able to kind of help make that clear to people, I think that's probably a bigger issue than brand name recognition in the wider world, but who knows?
Thank you so much for that. And I also want to say, we kind of heard a little bit of it. I wanted to say this to you while I had you in front of everyone. I love the way throughout Julie's book. We already know that it's a great design and it helped us, but there's always that like punchy humor that just kind of gets you, and you're like, "Oh, Julie." So I thank you for that as well, using awaking our elephant in that sense. But I know that you have to run, Julie. I'm going to say kind of parting words after you leave, but I just want to thank you for being here. Thank you for this book and for what you've done in our industry to make us all better learning experience designers. So thank you so much, Julie.
Oh, you're welcome. And I will say, it's in the end of the book. But one thing I'll throw out there is, I don't know if I knew that I could write a book like this without the example from Kathy Sierra. And I think a lot of people don't know who she is anymore, and that makes me sad because her stuff is still amazing. So she's got a book that is absolutely a like super crucial kind of add-on, or side by side with mine, called Badass: Making Users Better, or something. I may be getting the tagline on that wrong, but Kathy Sierra was absolutely my kind of inspiration in instructional design, and she also brought that kind of humor and irreverence to things. And so I was like, "Hey, that's really cool. I bet I could do that too." So anyway, but thank you everybody. This has been really fun, and thank you so much for engaging with this. Like any instructional designer, you just hope that stuff is helpful for people and that it helps them go out and do good things in the world. And clearly you all are. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Julie. Have a great day.
No.
Thank you. And everyone, I'm going to leave you with something at the end of Julie's book in the conclusion. And it says, small children are natural learners. They just suck information out of their environment through curiosity and play. Sometimes along the way, we lose that. We learn that learning is serious business and that it's hard and effortful. Learning designers have an opportunity to defy that notion and create marvelous, interesting, relevant learning environments. We can't make anybody learn, but we can make much better learning environments for them and help each learner to be the hero of their own learning journey. So thank you guys for investing your time to help people be the heroes of their own learning journey. I want to thank all of the co-hosts through these 6 weeks. I feel I'm getting emotional, and the chat moderators. It's just been amazing to see globally a community rally around being better at our craft. So hopefully this is not goodbye. Network with people, connect with people, go ahead and endorse them and all of the things. And we're so grateful that you've joined us for these 6 weeks. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.